On Christmas Day, 1875, while much of America was gathered in warmth and celebration, a quiet town in Mississippi became the stage for a story that history nearly buried. Charles Caldwell, a man born into slavery, a man who rose to become a Mississippi state senator, stepped into what he believed was a simple holiday meeting with someone he trusted. He never walked out again. This was not the fall of a criminal or a reckless rebel. This was the silencing of a voice that refused to bend. Caldwell represented something dangerous in his time, a formerly enslaved black man who believed in the power of law, the ballot, and courage over fear. He did not carry his fight with weapons, but with words, votes, and unwavering resolve. And for that, he became a target. His death was meant to send a message, not just to one man, but to an entire people daring to claim citizenship in a nation still struggling to accept them. Yet what his enemies failed to understand was this: killing a man does not kill an idea. In fact, sometimes it does the opposite. Today, we tell the story they tried to erase. A story of resilience forged in bondage, leadership born in chaos, and dignity maintained even in the face of betrayal. Charles Caldwell's life forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about power, justice, and the cost of standing firm when surrender would be safer. Before we dive deeper into this untold chapter of American history, take a moment to support the channel. If stories like this matter to you, stories of courage, forgotten heroes, service hint, and lessons that still echo today, please like this video, subscribe, and share it with others. Your support helps keep these voices alive. Now, let us go back to Mississippi, to a cold Christmas night in 1875, and uncover the story of the man they could not break. Caldwell's death did not end the tension that had been building across Mississippi. Instead, it released it. The moment word spread that he was gone, fear moved faster than truth, and uncertainty settled over towns that had already been living on the edge. What had begun as the silencing of one man quickly expanded into something far larger, exposing how fragile black political participation truly was during Reconstruction, and how dangerous it had become simply to stand in public as a leader. Caldwell had never been alone in his struggle. He was part of a generation of black Americans who believed that the promises made after the Civil War, citizenship, representation, equality before the law, were real and worth defending. His presence in politics symbolized progress that many welcomed but others deeply resented. When he was removed, the balance he helped hold together collapsed almost immediately. The sense of restraint that still lingered in some corners vanished, replaced by a belief that force, intimidation, and chaos would once again decide who belonged in public life. The violence that followed was not random, nor was it spontaneous. It unfolded with grim speed, touching families who had nothing to do with politics and individuals whose only crime was being associated with a man who refused to be silent. Caldwell's brother, who had lived outside the political spotlight, was caught in this wave and lost his life as well. His death made clear what many already feared. This was no longer about silencing a senator, but about sending a warning to an entire community. Leadership itself had become dangerous, visibility a risk, and participation a gamble with devastating consequences. Across the region, people who had once attended meetings, voted openly, or spoken confidently began to disappear from public spaces. Some stayed indoors, others fled to places where they hoped authority might offer protection, and many simply learned to lower their voices. The message was unmistakable. Reconstruction had opened doors, but those doors were now being forced shut, and the cost of walking through them was becoming unbearable. Caldwell's absence left a vacuum that could not easily be filled, not because others lacked courage, but because courage alone could no longer guarantee survival. What made this moment especially tragic was the contrast with everything Caldwell had believed in. He trusted institutions, laws, and dialogue, even when they failed him repeatedly. He had argued that progress came not from chaos, but from participation, not from fear but from persistence. Yet his death revealed how uneven that faith remained across the nation. While legal rights existed on paper, protection in practice was fragile, inconsistent, and often withheld at the moment it mattered most. The broader wave of violence following his murder exposed the limits of Reconstruction itself. It showed how quickly gains could be undone when intimidation replaced debate and when authority hesitated to act decisively. For black political leaders, the risks became starkly clear. Holding office was no longer just a responsibility. It was a test of endurance in a climate that treated ambition as provocation and success as defiance. And yet, even in the shadow of this terror, Caldwell's story did not dissolve into silence. The very effort to erase his influence revealed how powerful it had been. His life demonstrated what was possible, and his death exposed what remained unresolved. The violence that followed him was meant to discourage others from following his path, but it also preserved his place in history as a measure of how threatening dignity, intelligence, and resolve could be to an unjust system. In this way, the aftermath of Caldwell's murder becomes inseparable from the man himself. It transforms his story from a single tragedy into a reflection of an era, one where hope and fear existed side by side, and where the pursuit of equality demanded a courage that extended far beyond the individual, shaping generations that would come after him. Long before Charles Caldwell became a name spoken in political halls or whispered with fear by those who opposed him, he was simply a child born into a world that denied him ownership of his own life. The Mississippi he entered was shaped by endless rows of cotton, rigid hierarchies, customs and a system that measured human worth in labor and obedience. From his earliest days, Caldwell learned what it meant to work without rest, to endure commands without explanation, and to survive in an environment designed to limit both movement and ambition. Yet even within those narrow confines, something in him refused to accept that this was all his life would ever be. Plantation life was unrelenting, not only in its physical demands, but in the way it sought to shape the mind. Long hours in the fields were followed by nights of exhaustion, leaving little room for reflection or learning. Knowledge itself was treated as a threat, carefully guarded and deliberately withheld. To read or write was not simply unnecessary in the eyes of the system. It was dangerous. Words carried power, and power was something enslaved people were never meant to possess. Caldwell understood this instinctively, even before he could fully explain why the written word drew him so strongly. His pursuit of literacy was quiet and deliberate, shaped by caution as much as determination. Learning happened in stolen moments, guided by whispers, fragments of borrowed instruction, and a constant awareness of risk. Each letter learned was an act of defiance, not announced, but deeply felt. Reading became more than a skill. It became a way of seeing beyond the boundaries imposed on him, a glimpse of a wider world where thought itself could not be chained. Writing, in turn, offered something even more radical: the ability to record, to argue, to remember. These were tools the system feared, and that fear only confirmed their value. As Caldwell grew older, his path gradually shifted from the fields to the forge. Becoming a blacksmith altered his daily life in subtle but important ways. Skilled labor brought a measure of independence that few enslaved men experienced. The forge demanded precision, intelligence, and trust, and those who mastered it earned a different kind of standing within both the plantation and the surrounding community. Caldwell's hands shaped iron, but in doing so, he also reshaped how others perceived him. His work spoke before he did, earning respect in places where his voice alone might have been dismissed. This role granted him something rare: movement, interaction, and exposure to people and ideas beyond the narrow rhythm of plantation labor. It allowed him to listen, to observe, and to learn how power operated in everyday life. The forge became more than a workplace. It was a space where discipline, skill, and reputation intersected. Caldwell absorbed these lessons quietly, building not just tools, but confidence. So, the autonomy he gained was limited, but it was enough to nurture a sense of self that slavery had tried to erase. By the time freedom arrived, Caldwell was already prepared in ways that cannot be measured on paper. Literacy had sharpened his mind, and skilled labor had strengthened his standing. He had learned patience from endurance, strategy from survival, and resolve from years of silent resistance. These early experiences did not make him fearless, but they taught him how to move forward despite fear. The man who would later stand firm in the face of political intimidation was shaped long before he ever held office, forged in secrecy, discipline, and a belief that knowledge and dignity could exist even under the harshest conditions. In this way, Caldwell's beginnings are inseparable from his later life. The courage that defined his public legacy was born not in speeches or elections, but in the quiet determination of a young man who chose to learn when learning was forbidden, to master a craft when mastery offered no guarantees, and to imagine a future that the world around him insisted was impossible. When the Civil War ended, freedom arrived in Mississippi not as a clear victory, but as a fragile opening filled with uncertainty. For many, the transition from bondage to citizenship was disorienting, marked by promises that sounded powerful yet remained untested. For Charles Caldwell, this moment was not simply an end, but a beginning. The skills he had quietly built under slavery discipline, literacy, and an understanding of how authority functioned now found a new purpose. He stepped into public life at a time when the meaning of freedom itself was still being argued. Caldwell aligned himself with the radical Republicans not out of blind loyalty, but because their vision matched his own lived experience. They believed that freedom without rights was an illusion, and that citizenship had to be anchored in law, education, and political power. Mississippi, devastated by war and divided by resentment, became a testing ground for these ideas. When the state convened a constitutional convention in 1868, Caldwell was among the black delegates chosen to help define a new political foundation. His presence alone carried symbolic weight, but his contributions went further than symbolism. Inside the convention, Caldwell supported measures that reimagined Mississippi's future. The new constitution extended voting rights to all adult men, dismantling long-standing barriers that had excluded black citizens from political life. It also laid the groundwork for a public education system, a concept that challenged generations of inequality. Caldwell understood that education was not simply a social benefit, but a safeguard. He had lived in a world where ignorance was enforced, and he knew that access to learning was essential if freedom was to endure beyond one generation. His support for the 14th and 15th Amendments reflected this broader vision. Equal protection under the law and the right to vote were, to Caldwell, inseparable principles. One without the other left too much room for abuse. These amendments were not abstract ideals discussed in distant capitals. They were tools meant to protect real people in hostile environments. Caldwell championed them knowing that their implementation would be contested at every level, yet believing that retreat would only strengthen those who sought to reverse progress. Elected to the Mississippi State Senate, Caldwell entered an arena charged with tension. He was no longer simply advocating change. He was helping to enforce it. His role required constant navigation between hope and resistance, between the promise of Reconstruction and the realities of backlash. Voting rights, public schools, and fair representation became central to his work, not because they were politically convenient, but because they addressed the vulnerabilities he saw daily in black communities. Without these protections, freedom remained exposed. Caldwell's approach to politics was defined by restraint and conviction. He believed in institutions even as they faltered, and he insisted on participation even when intimidation made silence tempting. This faith in the process distinguished him and, paradoxically, made him more threatening to those determined to reclaim exclusive control. He was not calling for chaos or upheaval. He was demanding inclusion within the existing system. That demand, grounded in law and reason, proved difficult to dismiss and even harder to defeat. As violence intensified across Mississippi, Caldwell's commitment did not waver. He continued to argue that the ballot was more powerful than fear, and that education was the foundation of lasting change. His stance placed him at the center of Reconstruction's most bitter conflicts, where ideals collided with resistance and progress came at a personal cost. Yet through it all, Caldwell embodied the belief that citizenship was not granted by tolerance but secured through participation. This chapter of his life binds together everything that came before and everything that followed. The man who once risked punishment to learn his letters now helped write the rules of a new state. The blacksmith who shaped iron with precision applied the same discipline to shaping law. In embracing Reconstruction, Caldwell did more than hold office. He tested the nation's commitment to its own principles, standing as proof that freedom demanded not only courage to claim it, but perseverance to defend it. As Reconstruction entered its most unstable phase, the promises that once seemed within reach began to erode under constant pressure. Political participation for black citizens was no longer merely contested. It was actively challenged through fear, disruption, and organized intimidation. In this climate, Charles Caldwell stood out, not because he was untouched by danger, but because he refused to retreat from it. The same discipline that had carried him from slavery to public office now anchored him as the ground shifted beneath his feet. Caldwell understood that the struggle had changed. The battles were no longer fought only in legislatures or conventions, but in public gatherings, local elections, and everyday acts of civic life. Each appearance at a rally, each speech, each vote carried risk, yet he remained visible, believing that withdrawal would confirm the very message his opponents wanted to send. To step back, he believed, was to surrender the future to fear. This resolve was tested most severely in 1875, as Mississippi moved toward a decisive election. Tensions had been building for months, fueled by rhetoric that framed black political participation as a threat rather than a right. When a large political gathering was organized near Clinton, Caldwell supported an approach rooted in openness rather than exclusion. He believed that political disagreement, however sharp, should be addressed through words, not force. Inviting opposing voices to speak was, in his view, a way to demonstrate confidence in the democratic process and to show that reason could prevail even under strain. What followed exposed the fragility of that belief. What began as a public meeting quickly descended into chaos, and the violence that erupted marked a turning point. The events that came to be known as the Clinton massacre sent shockwaves far beyond the immediate area. Families fled, communities fractured, and a sense of vulnerability settled over black citizens who had once believed federal authority would stand behind them. Caldwell witnessed firsthand how quickly order could collapse and how unevenly protection was applied. In the days that followed, the situation worsened rather than stabilized. Armed groups moved freely, while those targeted for their political identity were left to seek safety wherever they could. Caldwell did not escape this reality, yet he refused to disappear. Instead, he worked to maintain calm among those who looked to him for guidance. Even as rumors spread and trust in institutions weakened, his leadership during this period was not defined by grand gestures, but by steadiness in a moment designed to produce panic. Perhaps most revealing was the response from beyond Mississippi. Appeals for decisive action were met with hesitation, delay, and carefully measured language. The absence of clear intervention signaled a painful truth. Federal commitment to protecting black citizens was conditional, limited by political fatigue and competing priorities. Caldwell recognized this shift, but he did not allow it to alter his stance. He continued to insist that participation mattered, even when protection was uncertain. On Election Day later that year, the weight of intimidation was impossible to ignore. Many who had once voted openly now hesitated, calculating the risks to themselves and their families. Caldwell refused to yield to that atmosphere. He urged those around him to remain composed, to act with dignity, and to remember why their participation mattered. Even when defeat became inevitable, he treated the act of voting itself as a form of resistance, a statement that fear would not have the final word. This period explains why Caldwell became such a powerful symbol, and why he was seen as such a threat. He did not call for retaliation or disorder. He called for persistence. He stood firm, not because he believed victory was guaranteed, but because he believed surrender would erase everything that had been fought for since emancipation. His resistance was quiet, disciplined, and relentless, rooted in the conviction that citizenship meant showing up even when the cost was high. In resisting terror without abandoning principle, Caldwell embodied the central tension of Reconstruction. He believed in a nation still deciding whether it believed in itself. The failures of protection, the hesitation of authority, and the violence surrounding him did not break that belief. Instead, they clarified it, revealing both the limits of the era and the depth of his courage. Though the men responsible for Charles Caldwell's death were never held accountable, history did not forget him. Silence may have followed in courtrooms, but his story endured far beyond verdicts and investigations. What Caldwell left behind was not merely the memory of a fallen politician, but a standard by which courage itself could be measured. In a time when fear shaped daily life and retreat often seemed like the safest choice, he showed what it meant to stand with dignity, even when the outcome was uncertain. Caldwell's legacy does not rest on a single office or a single moment. It lives in the arc of his life, from bondage to citizenship, from enforced silence to public leadership. He proved that resistance did not always require force, and that strength could exist in patience, discipline, and moral clarity. At every stage, he chose participation over withdrawal, believing that progress depended on those willing to remain visible when visibility carried risk. That belief ultimately cost him his life, but it also ensured that his example would outlast those who sought to erase him. His death marked more than the loss of one man. It revealed the fragility of justice in an era struggling to define itself. The failure to convict his killers exposed how unevenly the law was applied and how easily violence could hide behind indifference. Yet even this injustice adds to Caldwell's significance. He stands as a reminder that history is not shaped only by those who win power, but also by those who expose its limits. In confronting a system that could not fully protect him, Caldwell forced future generations to reckon with what freedom truly demands. Today, his story speaks across time. It reminds us that rights written on paper require courage in practice, and that progress is rarely secured in a straight line. Caldwell did not live to see the world he fought for fully realized, but his life helped carve a path toward it. His example challenges us to ask what it means to participate, to speak, and to stand firm when doing so is uncomfortable or costly. In remembering Charles Caldwell, we honor more than an individual. We honor an idea. That dignity cannot be granted or taken away by violence. That resistance can be calm and principled, and that even in the darkest periods of history, there are those who refuse to bend. His story remains a testament to the unyielding human spirit and a reminder that some lives, though cut short, continue to shape the moral direction of a nation. Thank you for staying with us through this powerful and often overlooked chapter of history. If this story moved you, challenged you, or taught you something new, please support the channel by liking this video and subscribing for more stories that deserve to be remembered. Your support helps keep these voices alive and ensures that the legacy of people like Charles Caldwell is never forgotten.